The air in my mother's dining room was heavy with the scent of lavender, and a silence that felt like a trap. Beatrice sat across from me, her fingers tapping rhythmically on a stack of legal documents that sat between us like a loaded weapon. Beside her, my brother Jude leaned back, a smug, practiced smile playing on his lips, the kind of smile he'd used since we were children to signal that he'd won and I'd already lost. "It's for the best, Lyra," my mother said, her voice dripping with that artificial, reasonable kindness she reserves for the moments she's most heartless. "We've handled the details. You just need to sign." I looked at the papers, then at the two people who shared my blood but not my soul, and I realized they truly believed they had me cornered. They thought they had finally appraised the value of my life and found it wanting. Please subscribe to support the channel. I bet you're watching this video right now while lying down with your legs crossed, right? If that's true, type 1. If not, type 2. Let's see whether I got it right. Alright, enough talking. Let's begin the story. My name is Lyra Thorne. I am 32 years old, and I deal in wreckage. As a maritime investigator, I spend my life on salt-stained decks and in cramped cargo holds, verifying ghost ships and unmasking insurance scams that the ocean tries to hide. I know what a lie looks like before it's even spoken. I've survived storms that would make most men weep, but nothing in the North Atlantic ever felt as cold as the look my mother is giving me right now. If you've ever been the sensible child, the one expected to be the load-bearing wall while your family shares an umbrella, then you know exactly where I am. Stay with me, because this story is the reason you should never mistake a woman's silence for her surrender. Growing up in the Thorne house, there were two children, but only one who mattered. Jude was the son, a self-proclaimed artist, whose potential was the only currency my mother traded in. Beatrice worshipped at the altar of his every whim, funding failed galleries and experimental music projects with a smile. I was the ghost in the hallway. I didn't have a soul for art, as my mother often put it. I had a mind for mechanics and ledgers. While Jude was performing at dinner parties, I was in the garage or hunched over textbooks. I wasn't rebellious. I was simply invisible. I became the daughter they couldn't ignore, only when my bank account became a solution to Jude's disasters. 3 years ago, I bought my anchor, a weathered colonial house in Cape May. I loved the way the third step creaked and how the afternoon sun turned the oak floors to gold. But because I catch fraudsters for a living, I didn't put my name on the deed. I created Blackwood Anchor Ventures LLC. It was a professional reflex, a way to protect my sanctuary from the world I saw every day. My mother finally offered a compliment when she saw the porch, but I noticed her eyes measuring the square footage, calculating how many of Jude's gambling debts it could vanish. I thought the house was my fortress. I didn't realize it was about to become the site of the greatest betrayal I would ever face, a scheme they'd been building while I was 3,000 miles away, breathing in the salt of the Bermuda Sea. The mission in Bermuda was a deliberate immersion in chaos, a salvage operation for a foundered freighter that demanded every ounce of my focus. For 12 days, I lived in a world of rusting iron, rhythmic tides, and the relentless pressure of deadlines. The salt air stung my lungs, and the constant hum of the ship's engines became the heartbeat of my existence. It was exactly what I needed, a place where the variables were physical and the stakes were clear. I called my mother every other evening, the satellite connection crackling with the distance. Her voice always sounded distant, too, not just geographically, but emotionally. She was hurried, her sentences clipped, always ending the conversation with a reminder that Jude was going through a creative block and needed her full attention. I didn't mind. In fact, I felt a familiar, hollow relief. Her preoccupation with Jude was my shield. It meant she wasn't looking at me, which usually meant my life was safe. Or so I believed. I told her about the plumbing issue I'd mentioned before I left, a minor leak in the upstairs bath. She'd promised to have a contractor look at it, and I'd left her my spare key, a gesture of trust that now felt like I'd handed a lit match to an arsonist. The return to Cape May was supposed to be my decompression. I drove south from the airport, the Subaru's tires humming against the asphalt, my mind already drifting toward a hot shower and the silence of my own hallways. But as I pulled into the driveway, the world shifted on its axis. The house looked the same, the white trim crisp against the gray siding, the porch swaying slightly in the coastal breeze, but the energy was wrong. It was the specific, vibrating silence of a crime scene. When I stepped onto the porch and slid my key into the deadbolt, it didn't just snag. It hit a wall. I tried again, my pulse starting to thrum in my fingertips. I jiggled the handle, then stepped back to look at the lock. It was new, bright, unweathered brass that didn't recognize my touch. Before I could even process the rejection, the door swung inward. It wasn't my mother who stood there, but a man in a work vest, a clipboard in his hand, and a look of confused authority on his face. Behind him, my living room, the room I had painted with my own hands, was filled with cardboard boxes. My bookshelves were half empty. My grandmother's antique rug was gone. "Can I help you?" the man asked, his voice echoing in a space that was no longer mine. When I told him I lived there, he didn't apologize. He looked at me with a pity that felt like a slap. "Ma'am, I'm with the staging company. The new owners are moving in on Friday. The closing was finalized last Tuesday." The words didn't make sense. You can't close on a house that isn't for sale. You can't sell a soul you don't own. I walked back to my car, my legs feeling like lead, and dialed my mother. The call went straight to voicemail. I tried again, blocked. I tried Jude. Nothing. It was then that the first email arrived, a short, jagged message from Jude that stripped away the last of my delusions. "Mom told us you wanted to help. You always said you had enough. Well, now Jude has enough too. Don't make this ugly, Lyra. We did what we had to do for the family." The next 48 hours were a masterclass in isolation. I was a maritime investigator, a woman who found things that were meant to stay lost, and yet I was being erased from my own life by the people who had raised me. My mother's house was dark when I drove by. Jude's apartment was empty. They weren't just hiding, they were executing a strategy of silence. I sought refuge at Sloane Whitaker's apartment, my best friend, since the days when we were both just trying to survive our respective family dynamics. Sloane didn't offer platitudes. She didn't tell me it would be okay. She simply cleared her dining table and set her laptop down. "We don't need a shoulder to cry on, Lyra," she said, her voice sharp with a familiar, protective anger. "We need a forensic trail. If they sold that house, they used a paper trail that leads right back to a grave they dug for you." The weight of the betrayal sat in my chest like a phantom limb, but as Sloane began to pull the public records, the investigator in me began to wake up. We found it within the hour. A quitclaim deed filed 4 days into my Bermuda trip. It bore my signature, a jagged, slanted imitation of my handwriting that wouldn't have fooled a child, yet had been stamped by a notary named Vance Sterling. The name hit me like a physical blow. Vance, the man my mother had been seeing, the investment expert who smelled of expensive cologne and desperation. He hadn't just seduced my mother, he had weaponized her. That night, as the rain began to lash against Sloane's windows, I walked down to the harbor to see Captain Elias. He had been my father's oldest friend, a man who lived on a trawler and saw everything that happened on the Cape May waterfront. He met me on the dock, his face etched with a grim sympathy. "I saw them, Lyra," he said, handing me a small memory card. "I saw the trucks. I saw that man Vance directing them like he was the king of the hill. I kept the security feed from my slip. I figured you'd be wanting to see the faces of the people who think they can sink a ship like yours." I went back to Sloane's and watched the footage. There was my mother, holding the door open. There was Jude, laughing as he carried my grandmother's recipe box to a waiting van. And there was Vance Sterling, his hand on my mother's shoulder, a smile on his face that was the purest expression of a predator I had ever seen. I didn't cry. The time for tears had ended, the moment that brass key failed to turn. I looked at the screen, then at the folders Sloane had opened: bank accounts, LLC filings, the Blackwood Anchor documents they had never even bothered to look for because they assumed I was as transparent as they were. They thought I was the ghost in the hallway. They thought they had sold my house to pay for Jude's sins. What they didn't realize was that I didn't just own the house. I owned the architecture of their downfall. I wasn't going to beg for my life back. I was going to audit it, piece by piece, until there was nothing left for them to hide behind. The maritime investigator was no longer looking for wreckage. I was creating it. The invitation to dinner arrived 3 days later, delivered not with an apology, but with the practiced entitlement of a woman who believed she had already won. My mother's voice on the voicemail was syrupy, a carefully constructed melody of feigned concern. She spoke about moving forward and resolving the misunderstanding, as if she hadn't signed my name to a fraudulent deed while I was breathing salt air in Bermuda. I sat in Sloane's kitchen, listening to the recording, my hands wrapped around a chipped ceramic mug. I didn't cry. I didn't feel the urge to scream. Instead, I felt the cold, familiar clarity of a maritime audit. I knew that to Beatrice and Jude, my silence was a sign of defeat. They expected me to show up broken, desperate for a portion of the sale proceeds to stay afloat. They didn't realize that in the world of forensics, silence isn't a void, it's a strategic position. I arrived at my mother's house at exactly 6:00 p.m. The Cape May air was beginning to bite, a sharp reminder that the season was turning. Inside, the house smelled of pot roast, and a tension so thick, it felt like a physical barrier. The table was set with the blue-rimmed plates my grandmother always reserved for important occasions. Gerald or Vance Sterling, as I now knew him, was seated at the head of the table, his gold pinky ring catching the light as he reached for a wine glass. Jude sat beside him, wearing a new watch that I knew my house had paid for. Beatrice hugged me at the door, her touch light and non-committal, the embrace of a woman hugging a smoke alarm she hoped wouldn't go off. "Sit, Lyra," she said, gesturing to a seat that felt like an interrogation chair. "We've had a long talk, and we're willing to be generous. Jude's debts are managed, and Vance has found a way for you to receive a small percentage of the equity as a consultation fee for the transition." She spoke as if she were a benevolent queen distributing alms, not a mother who had just committed a felony. Jude nodded, his mouth full of bread. "It's more than you'd get if we let the collectors take everything, sis. You should be grateful." I looked at them, the artist who produced nothing, the mother who loved only the spotlight, and the predator who smelled of expensive cologne, and I felt a surge of something sharper than anger. I felt a profound, surgical indifference. I reached into my bag and pulled out a manila folder, setting it on the table next to the roast. The room went still, the only sound the faint hum of the refrigerator. Vance informed me that the closing was finalized last Tuesday," I said. My voice level and factual, the clinical tone I used when reading a black box recorder. "But I have a question. Did any of you, at any point, check the actual chain of title?" Beatrice blinked, her fork hovering in midair. "What are you talking about? It's your house. I signed for you, as your mother." I pushed a single document across the table. It was the operating agreement for Blackwood Anchor Ventures LLC. "Actually, Mom, that's the mistake that ends this story. I don't own that house. Blackwood Anchor Ventures LLC owns it. And as the maritime investigator you've spent 5 years calling boring, I ensured that I am the sole member with signing authority. Your power of attorney was for me, personally, not the LLC." I watched the blood drain from Vance's face. He knew real estate law well enough to understand the LLC bomb I had just detonated. The quitclaim deed they had filed wasn't just problematic, it was legally void. It carried the same weight as a napkin with a crayon scribble. But I wasn't finished. I pulled out a second sheet, the bank record Sloane had helped me recover. "And Vance, let's talk about your consultation. You told my mother the house was worth $190,000 to push a quick sale to your associates. I have the appraisal here for $245,000. You pocketed the $55,000 margin through an offshore account, and then you went back and emptied the $18,000 savings account I shared with my mother. You didn't just rob me, you robbed the woman you're currently dating." The explosion was immediate. Beatrice turned on Vance, her face contorting as the wall of paper she had leaned on began to shred. Jude started to shout about his career, but I stood up, the chair scraping against the hardwood like a final punctuation mark. The police are already at Vance's apartment. The county recorder has flagged the deed as fraudulent. And Mom, I'm not signing anything. I'm taking my house back, and I'm taking my life back. I walked out of that house as the shouting faded behind me. The following weeks were a blur of depositions and locksmiths, but the outcome was as certain as the tide. Vance Sterling faced 3 counts of felony fraud. Jude was forced into a bankruptcy that no heart emoji from Beatrice could fix. And my mother? She was left in the silence of her own making, a formal warning on her record, and a daughter who finally knew the difference between being a load-bearing wall and being a person. I am back in my house now. The 3rd step still creaks. The 4:17 light still turns the kitchen to gold. I've replaced the locks with a system that only recognizes one thumbprint mine. On my counter sits my grandmother's recipe box, the one Jude had tried to throw away. I opened it today and found a note I hadn't seen before. It was in her steady, blue-inked hand. The anchor only works if it's attached to the ship, not the sand. I sat in my kitchen, drinking coffee from my chipped mug, and for the first time in 32 years, I didn't feel like a ghost in my own life. I am Dr. Lyra Thorne. I am a maritime investigator, and I have never been prouder of the architecture I built to survive. The legal fallout was as precise and inevitable as a tide chart. Vance Sterling was sentenced to 18 months in state prison for felony, forgery, and fraud, the judge showing absolutely no sympathy for a man who had made a career out of exploiting the trust of others. He was ordered to pay full restitution, though I knew the money he'd skimmed was likely already ghosted through the same offshore channels I spend my days investigating. My mother, Beatrice, was not prosecuted. The district attorney cited insufficient evidence of her full legal understanding, but she was issued a formal warning that now sits on her permanent record like a jagged reef. As for Jude, the spotlight he craved finally found him in the form of a Chapter 7 bankruptcy filing, stripping away the luxury watches and the pretension, leaving him to finally face the reality of his own hollow architecture. I am back in my house in Cape May now. The court voided the fraudulent deed within weeks, returning the title to Blackwood Anchor Ventures LLC, where it belongs. The 3rd step still creaks when I climb it in the dark, and the 4:17 light still paints the oak floors in gold. But the air feels different, lighter, cleaner, purged of the cologne and the lies. I've installed a new biometric lock on the front door, one that only responds to the thumbprint of the woman who actually earned the right to be here. My mother and I do not speak. It isn't a dramatic, shouting silence. It's an honest one. I didn't lose a family. I revised the narrative until the only people left at the table were the ones who actually chose to be there. I spent 32 years believing that being a good daughter meant being a load-bearing wall for a structure that was never designed to protect me. I thought my competence was a debt I owed them, rather than a gift I had built for myself. I was wrong. Setting a boundary isn't an act of revenge. It is the ultimate act of maritime survival. On my kitchen counter, next to the chipped mug that has outlasted all of this, sits my grandmother's recipe box. I found one last note tucked into the back today, written in her steady blue ink. You are allowed to keep what you built, even from the people you love. My name is Lyra Thorne. I am an investigator, a homeowner, and finally, a woman who is no longer a ghost in her own life. I built this life, brick by brick, and I have never been prouder of the paperwork that proves it. If you're sitting at a table where you're always the one expected to sacrifice, remember this. The truth doesn't expire, and you are the only one who holds the key to the door. Healing is not a destination. It is a slow, methodical reconstruction of a shoreline after a catastrophic storm. 2 weeks after the locks were changed and the legal dust began to settle, I found myself sitting in a quiet coffee shop in Middletown, halfway between my sanctuary in Cape May and the life my family had tried to build on the ruins of mine. Jude walked in, looking as though he had been hollowed out from the inside. The golden boy persona had vanished, replaced by the weary, sharp edges of a man who had finally run out of rooms to hide in. He sat across from me, his hands trembling as he gripped a cup of coffee he never intended to drink. We didn't do preamble. I looked at him, not with the anger that had fueled my investigation, but with the clinical detachment of a woman reading a final report. I want to know why, Jude, I said, my voice as level as the horizon. For a long time, the only sound was the low hum of the espresso machine. Then, Jude looked at his hands and whispered, "Because you were going to be everything I wasn't, and I couldn't handle the weight of it." It was the first honest sentence he had spoken to me in a decade. He admitted that the sabotage went deeper than the house. He had even made anonymous inquiries to Oceanic Risk Solutions, trying to flag my maritime credentials as fraudulent, desperate to find one crack in the load-bearing wall I had become. I didn't yell. I didn't need to. I simply told him that while I wasn't closing the door to our relationship, the conditions for his return were non-negotiable. He had to tell the truth to every aunt, uncle, and cousin he had lied to for years. "Sorry is just a word, Jude," I reminded him. "It's a starting place, not a finish line." The silence from my mother was different. It was a heavy, suffocating thing until a letter arrived in the mail. It was handwritten, the ink slightly smeared, as if she had hesitated over every word. She didn't offer excuses this time. She admitted that she had enabled through silence, choosing the temporary peace of Jude's lies over the difficult fairness of my truth. She wrote about the shame of seeing the return-to-sender envelopes in her own drawer, realizing she had been complicit in erasing her own daughter. I read that letter at my kitchen table, my thumb tracing the crack in my favorite mug. I didn't cry, but I placed it in the same drawer as my grandmother's recipe box, a small, imperfect step toward a reconciliation that might take years to realize. The culmination of my professional recovery came a month later at the Maritime Security Gala in Philadelphia. It was a world of crisp uniforms, crystal glasses, and the high-stakes energy of an industry that values precision above all else. When my name was called for the Investigator of the Year award, I walked to the stage in a simple black dress, the spotlight warm and unforgiving. I looked out at the audience and saw Sloan, Captain Elias, and my team, the family I had chosen. But then, my gaze drifted to the very back row. There, sitting stiffly in seats they hadn't quite earned but were allowed to occupy, were Beatrice and Jude. My mother was in a navy dress, her hands clasped in her lap, her eyes a chaotic war of pride and grief. I kept my speech short. I told the room that sometimes the people you need aren't the ones you were born to, but the ones who choose to stand by you when the ship is sinking. After the gala, my father's old friend, Captain Elias, found Jude near the exit. He didn't offer a polite handshake. He looked at my brother and said, "You should have been a lot of things to her, son, but we're here now." It was a quiet, devastating reminder of the years that had been lost to an architecture of deception. The story didn't end with a grand, cinematic embrace. It ended on a Sunday morning in February, with a light snow falling outside my kitchen window at Cape May. I was making French toast, the sizzle of the pan the only sound in the house until the doorbell rang. I opened the door to find Beatrice and Jude standing on the porch, clutching a tin of homemade shortbread and a bottle of orange juice like they were offerings to a goddess they were still learning to appease. "Come in," I said. I pointed Beatrice toward the stove and handed the plates to Jude. "You can set the table." I watched him count the plates. 4. He set them down one by one, with a care that suggested he finally understood they could break. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't the childhood I deserved, or the easy resolution that movies promise. It was awkward, quiet, and real. But as we sat down at the table I had fought to keep, under the light I had earned, I realized that I wasn't the one holding the door open for everyone else anymore. I was the one who controlled the key. I didn't need revenge on my family. I simply became someone who didn't need their permission to exist. My name is Lyra Thorne. I am a daughter, an investigator, and an architect of my own peace. 4 plates. It's a start. The silence that followed the lockout wasn't an empty void. It was a heavy, calculated architecture of exclusion. I sat in my Subaru for a long time. That first night, the dark green metal, a thin shell against a world that had suddenly decided I no longer belonged in it. I had spent 32 years as the load-bearing wall of the Thorne family, the one who held the ceiling up while my mother and Jude walked underneath without ever looking up to check for cracks. But the moment I wasn't useful, the moment my bank account was more attractive than my presence, the wall was demolished. I was no longer a daughter. I was a line item that had been successfully audited out of existence. I remember the specific, hollow vibration of my phone on the passenger seat. I called my mother 14 times in those first 48 hours. The first 3 went to voicemail, the familiar, breezy recording of her voice telling me she was busy living the dream and to leave a message. By the 5th call, the tone changed. It was a short, sharp ring before the automated voice informed me that the caller was not accepting calls at this time. Blocked. I was 32, a chief maritime investigator who had stared down corporate syndicates and navigated the legal labyrinths of international waters, and I was being ghosted by the woman who had taught me how to tie my shoes. I tried Jude next. His response was a single text that arrived at 2:00 a.m. The glowing screen, illuminating the interior of my car with a clinical, unforgiving light. Mom says you're making a scene, Lyra. You've always been the difficult one. We're finally at peace. Don't ruin this for us. Peace. That was the word they used to describe a 5-year blackout, a period where my absence was the fuel for their comfort. This wasn't just a lockout, it was a campaign. My mother wasn't protecting Jude. She was protecting the narrative she had built, an architecture of deception where I was the selfish, boring daughter who had abandoned her family, while she and Vance Sterling were the weary survivors. There is a specific kind of trauma in being the child your mother doesn't worry about. It sounds like a freedom, but in reality, it is a ranking. It means you are the one she doesn't think about because she assumes your strength is infinite. She thought I was strong enough to lose my home, strong enough to be called a fraud, and strong enough to watch her sell my grandmother's legacy to fund my brother's failures. And she used that strength as her permission to neglect me. I sat in the Subaru, clutching my grandmother's chipped mug, the one thing Jude hadn't managed to throw away yet, and realized that for 32 years, I had been feeding a ghost. I remember driving to the harbor that night, the rain turning the Cape May streets into a shimmering, distorted mirror. I had $46 in my checking account because I'd just authorized a massive salvage bond in Bermuda, and I was homeless. I parked near the docks where the air smelled of salt and diesel, a familiar, honest scent that didn't ask me for anything. I watched the lights of the trawlers bobbing in the dark and felt the shape of the truth I had always known, but never dared to speak aloud. My mother hadn't borrowed my house. She had stolen my identity to pay for a version of Jude that didn't exist. The word family is often used as a weapon when people want something from you that a stranger would never dare ask. A stranger doesn't forge your signature on a quitclaim deed. A stranger doesn't change your locks while you're 3,000 miles away. A stranger doesn't call you mismatched or poor because your suit is from 2005 or your hands are stained with the work that actually pays the bills. But family? Family calls it help. My mother had a phrase she used for every betrayal she committed on Jude's behalf. He just needs a little help. Help, in Beatrice's vocabulary, had no upper limit, and apparently, no moral floor. I stayed in Sloane's spare room for 6 days, before I even stopped shaking. It was a week of pure, unadulterated silence from Hartford. No emails, no letters, no intermediaries. They had erased me from the family tree, with the same surgical precision I usually reserved for my salvage reports. I realized then that they hadn't just lied to me, they had lied about me to everyone we knew. They told Aunt Martha I was in rehab. They told Uncle Roy I had sold the house myself and skipped town with the money. They flipped the story so perfectly that their grief became their justification. They weren't the villains in their version of the story. I was the phantom limb they were finally learning to live without. But here is the thing about being the daughter no one worries about. When the load-bearing wall finally cracks, the whole house comes down. I didn't stop crying because I felt better. I stopped because I realized that precision is a decision, and I had decided to audit my life. I stopped being the daughter who begged for a seat at the table and started being the woman who owned the room. I took the folder Sloane had prepared, the LLC filings, the forged deed, the timestamps of my calls, and I realized that while they had the family label, I had the paperwork. And in a world built on deeds and titles, the woman with the paperwork is the only one who survives. I wasn't going to make a scene. I was going to conduct a forensic investigation into the people who thought I was too boring to fight back. The blackout was over. I was about to turn the lights on, and I didn't care who was blinded by the glare. Living in Sloane, Whitaker's spare room felt like being a castaway in my own city. The air in her apartment was sterile, vibrating with the low-frequency hum of server towers and the constant flickering blue light glow of multiple monitors. It was a cybersecurity fortress, a stark and cold contrast to the oak-scented colonial house in Cape May that I had bought with 8 years of overtime and a heart full of hope. I sat on a futon that had seen better days, clutching the chipped ceramic mug I had managed to grab from my car cup holder. The crack along the rim was a familiar map, the only tangible thing I had left that hadn't been sold, rebranded, or managed by my mother's betrayal. For the first 48 hours, I existed in a state of clinical shock, a phase of darkness where my professional armor was stripped away, leaving only the invisible child, who had spent her life trying to earn a gaze that was always fixed on someone else. Sloane didn't offer the soft, useless comfort of a friend who tells you it will all be okay. She understood my language, the language of forensics and audits. We spent the nights in a silent, determined trance, auditing the wreckage of my family's deception. She tracked digital footprints through encrypted portals while I read through the public records and the forged quitclaim deed again and again. It was a masterclass in arrogance and sloppiness. The signature Beatrice had forged was a slanted imitation that ignored the way my M always leans left, a detail she'd never noticed because she'd never truly looked at anything I had built. She had handed my front door key to Vance Sterling, a man who smelled of expensive cologne and the specific, acrid scent of a con in progress, believing his lies were a lifeline for her golden boy, Jude. They thought I was a ghost, a phantom limb they could prune to save the tree. On the third night, Captain Elias arrived. He didn't knock. He pounded on the door like a boarding party, smelling of salt, pipe tobacco, and 60 years of maritime integrity. He had been my father's first mate and my unofficial compass since the day Beatrice decided I was too boring to warrant her attention. He sat in Sloane's kitchen, his weathered hands dwarfing a paper cup of coffee, looking at me with eyes that had seen 1,000 shipwrecks and never once looked away. He didn't ask how I was feeling. He was a man of the sea. He knew the tide was out. Instead, he pulled a small, silver memory card from his pocket and set it on the table like a challenge. "The Cape May docks have long memories, Lyra," he said, his voice a gravelly rumble that cut through the sterile hum of the servers. "I saw them. I saw that man Vance directing the trucks while you were away. I kept the security feed from my slip. I figured the best investigator in the Atlantic might want to see the exact moment her ship was scuttled." We plugged the card into Sloane's workstation, and the footage that played was grainy, monochromatic, and utterly devastating. There, on my own porch, under the light I had paid for, was my mother. She was holding the door open, her face a mask of practiced, reasonable helpfulness, while Jude laughed, hauling boxes of my life into a waiting van. I watched them carry out my grandmother's antique rug and the tin recipe box, the one Jude had treated like a suggestion, but was actually my only inheritance of love. I saw Vance Sterling patting Beatrice on the back, a predatory smile on his face that revealed he was the one truly holding the pen while they played house with my wreckage. Seeing it wasn't a wound, it was a cauterization. The raw pain of the betrayal was suddenly replaced by a cold, forensic precision. I wasn't just a daughter anymore. I was a maritime investigator with a crime scene, a time-stamped log, and a list of perpetrators. "Don't let them make you small, Lyra," Elias said, his eyes as steady as a lighthouse in a gale. "A storm doesn't change the nature of the rock, it just shows you what's underneath." He reminded me that the chosen family, Elias, Sloane, and the ghost of my grandmother were the only ones who saw the value in the load-bearing wall I had become. My mother had made a fatal error in her architecture of deception. She thought she was selling a house to save a son who would never be enough. She didn't realize she was declaring war on the woman who knew how to find every sunken secret in the North Atlantic. I stood up, the chair scraping against the floor like a call to action, my hands no longer shaking. The phase of darkness was over. I realized then that my competence wasn't a debt I owed them. It was a weapon they had handed me. I wasn't going to beg for a seat at their table or a key to my own door. I was going to dismantle the table entirely, piece by piece, using the very tools of precision and paperwork they had so arrogantly dismissed. I was no longer a castaway. I was the chief of the salvage operation, and I was about to bring the truth to the surface, no matter who it drowned. I didn't go back to the harbor to cry, and I didn't stay on Sloane's futon to mourn the mother I thought I had. In the world of maritime salvage, once a ship is scuttled, you don't stand on the shore and wring your hands. You suit up, check your oxygen levels, and dive into the wreckage to see what can be recovered. I stopped being Lyra Thorne, the boring daughter, and became Lyra Thorne, the chief maritime investigator for Oceanic Risk Solutions. I treated my own life like a foundered freighter, and for the next week, Sloane's apartment became my command center. The sterile hum of her servers provided the white noise I needed to drown out the echoes of my mother's betrayal. Precision, I reminded myself, is a decision. And I had decided to be the most precise woman in the state of New Jersey. My journey of rebirth began with a yellow legal pad and a stack of folders that smelled of old ink and high-stakes litigation. I didn't reach for a phone to beg Beatrice for an explanation. I reached for my professional network to conduct an audit. While Jude was likely celebrating his inheritance and my mother was playing house with her predator, I was tracing the audit trail of their crimes. With Sloane's help, we began to peel back the layers of Vance Sterling's architecture of deception. We discovered that Vance hadn't just seduced my mother into a crime. He had profiled her. He knew she would never look at the fine print because she was too busy looking at the reflection of the golden daughter she wished she had. Using the same forensic tools I used to track stolen cargo containers across the Atlantic, I began to follow the money. It was a classic quitclaim scam, but with a parasitic twist. We discovered that the house in Cape May, which had a market value of at least $245,000, had been sold in a private, off-market transaction for a mere $187,000. The buyers were a young couple, the Petersons, who had been lured in by a price that seemed too good to be true. But the real wreckage lay in the margins. Vance Sterling had tranced a $23,000 finder's fee directly into a private account in his name, money my mother thought was going to pay off Jude's gambling debts. He was cannibalizing the very family he was pretending to save. As I wrote the numbers down, I felt a cold, surgical satisfaction. Every dollar he stole was another nail in the coffin of his freedom. But my strongest unsinkable shield was the one I had built 3 years ago, out of professional reflex, Blackwood Anchor Ventures, LLC. I spent hours at Ruthie's kitchen table, another member of my chosen family, who had been physically removed from Beatrice's table years ago, reviewing my operating agreement. I verified every comma and every clause. Because the house was owned by a legal entity, and not by me personally, my mother's forged signature on a personal quitclaim deed was a legal nullity. It carried the same weight as a child's drawing of a boat. She had signed as Lyra Thorne's mother, but the owner of the house was a corporate ghost that didn't have a mother. I can feel the load-bearing wall of my identity, the one Beatrice had tried to demolish, reinforcing itself with every page I turned. Captain Elias became my tactical advisor. He didn't just provide the video evidence of the move-out, he helped me map the Bermuda Triangle of Vance Sterling's past. We found that Vance's real estate license hadn't just lapsed, it had been revoked 4 years earlier for misrepresentation in a closing. He was a repeat offender, a man who had made a career out of finding widows in the third pew and turning their trust into equity. I recorded his notary's stamp number and tracked his associate, a man named Vince Cletty, who was notorious for acknowledging signatures without the signer present. I was no longer a victim of a family drama. I was a witness to a multi-layered criminal conspiracy. During this journey, I didn't wake up hoping for a call from Beatrice. I woke up hoping for a confirmation from the county recorder. I stopped eating cereal at midnight, and started making my grandmother's lemon chicken, standing in Sloane's kitchen and reading the old recipe cards like they were navigation charts. I realized that I didn't need Beatrice's approval to be a daughter, and I didn't need Jude's respect to be a sister. I was the daughter of the woman who had written those cards, a woman who believed that the food was better when you followed the handwritten truth rather than the online lie. By the end of the week, my rebuilding was complete. I had a folder containing the forged deed, the time-stamped security footage from Captain Elias, the records of Vance's revoked license, and the proof of the $18,000 he had drained from the savings account Beatrice thought was her safety net. I had built an architecture of my own, not one made of wood and oak, but one made of facts and ranjai, boundaries. I was ready to step out of the darkness of Sloane's apartment and back into the light of the Cape May sun. I wasn't going back to ask for my house. I was going back to reclaim my sovereignty. The maritime investigator had finished the salvage operation. Now, it was time for the reckoning. I picked up my grandmother's chipped mug, the crack along the rim, a badge of survival, and dialed the one person who could help me pull the trigger. My attorney, Helen Marsh. The boring daughter was about to become the most interesting person in the courtroom. The invitation to what my mother called a reconciliation dinner arrived with the strategic timing of a pincer movement. Beatrice's voice on the message was a masterpiece of feigned vulnerability, a carefully pitched melody designed to pull at the heartstrings of the daughter she assumed was still desperate for her approval. She spoke of healing the family and moving past the misunderstandings, as if the felony she'd committed was merely a spilled glass of wine on a white rug. I sat in Sloane's kitchen, listening to the recording, while the blue light of the servers flickered against my grandmother's chipped mug. I didn't feel anger. I felt the cold, rhythmic precision of a maritime audit. To Beatrice and Jude, my week of silence was a white flag. They expected me to show up broken, ready to accept whatever crumbs of equity Vance Sterling had decided to leave me. They had no idea that in the world of forensics, silence isn't an absence of noise. It's the math of a trap being set. The ambush was set for 1, but the table was set for 9. When I arrived at my mother's house, the house with the yellow kitchen and the brass chandelier that has hummed with a faulty wire since 2011, the room was already full of the loyalists. Uncle Roy was in the corner, his eyes wary. Aunt Martha was pouring wine with a hand that shook slightly. In the center of the room sat Vance Sterling, positioned at the head of the table, like a man who had recently promoted himself to a position he'd invented. He smelled of too much cologne, and the smug satisfaction of a predator who thinks the sheep has walked back into the pen. Jude sat beside him, wearing a new watch and a $400 shirt, with the adhesive from the price tag still faintly visible on the collar. A trophy of the house he thought he'd successfully stolen from me. Beatrice hugged me at the door, with the enthusiasm of a woman hugging a smoke alarm she hoped wouldn't go off. "Sit down, Lyra," she whispered, her voice a practiced silk. "We've handled the details. We just need you to be reasonable so we can all move forward." I sat. I watched the pot roast steam in the center of the table and listened to the forced clatter of silverware. I let them talk. I let Jude brag about his upcoming project and let Vance explain the volatility of the current market with the authority of a man who didn't realize I had already traced his revoked license. Let me tell you about silence. In a room full of people who have wronged you, it is arithmetic. I was counting what I knew against what they thought they knew, and the distance between those numbers was where my sovereignty lived. The reveal didn't happen because the moment was right. It happened because Beatrice couldn't wait any longer to taste her victory. She folded her napkin with a final, sharp movement and looked at me with that reasonable face, the one that says, "I have decided this is fair, and your job is to agree." "I sold the house, Lyra," she said, her voice flat and factual, as if she were returning a library book. "Jude needed help. Family sacrifices for family. I guess you're homeless now, sis," Jude added with a short, approving laugh. Gerald Vance wiped his mouth and nodded. "It's a transition, Lyra. You have a job, you have skills. You can start over. Jude can't." I didn't scream, I didn't cry. I set my fork down on the blue-rimmed plate very carefully and smiled. The room went still. the specific kind of still where 14 people stop breathing, and the only sound is the chandelier buzzing overhead. "I have one question," I said, my voice as clear as a bell in a fog. "Who exactly signed the deed?" Beatrice blinked. "I did. As your mother. It's your house, Lyra. Your name." "My name," I said, leaning forward into the 4:17 p.m. light that was fading through the window, "is not on the title." I reached into my bag and pulled out the manila folder Sloane and I had prepared. I set it on the table like a lead weight. "The house in Cape May is held by Blackwood Anchor Ventures LLC. I am the sole member. I am the only officer with signing authority. You forged my personal signature on a quitclaim deed for a property I do not personally own." I watched the machinery of Beatrice's mind stall. I watched Vance look at his wine glass, the gold pinky ring trembling just a fraction of a millimeter. "You didn't sell my house, Mom," I said, reciting the facts like a title examiner reading a death warrant. "You committed a felony. And Vance? I know about the $23,000 margin you skimmed from the Petersons. I know about the $18,000 you took from the savings account I built for Mom." The silence in the room was no longer mine. It was theirs. They were looking at a wall they had leaned on every day, and realizing for the first time it was made of paper. I wasn't the boring daughter anymore. I was the one with the paperwork. And in a world of lies, the woman with the paperwork turns out to be the one they should have worried about. The silence that followed my revelation wasn't just a lack of sound. It was a structural failure of the air in the room. Vance Sterling or Gerald Pratt, as his rap sheet likely recorded him, tried to find his voice, but it came out as a strangled, dry rasp. He reached for his water glass, his gold pinky ring clicking sharply against the rim, a desperate, rhythmic sound that echoed the buzzing of the faulty chandelier overhead. "Now, Lyra, let's not get ahead of ourselves," he started, his investment expert mask slipping to reveal a terrified man whose exit routes were being boarded up in real time. "Property law is complex. A quitclaim deed signed by a primary resident, a quitclaim deed signed by a person who doesn't own the property, is a piece of fiction, Gerald," I interrupted, using the name from his revoked license just to see him flinch. I leaned back, letting the cold roast and the shattered expectations sit on the table like a lead weight. I spent 8 years in overtime and 47 months packing lunches to build a sanctuary no one in this family bothered to ask about. Because I catch fraudsters like you for a living. I review titles while you're still rehearsing your next con. I didn't just buy a house, I built an architecture of protection. Blackwood Anchor Ventures LLC is the only entity that exists on that deed. My mother didn't sell my house because she had no house to sell. Beatrice's face was a study in moral deconstruction. She looked at the man she'd invited into her heart, then at the folder I'd placed on the table, the folder containing the audit trail of her own betrayal. The reasonable mother who had already decided my homelessness was a fair price for Jude's comfort was suddenly realizing she'd been the architect of her own ruin. "But you told me the paperwork was handled, Gerald," she whispered, her voice thin and ruined, looking at a wall she'd leaned on every day, and realizing for the first time it was made of paper. "He lied, Mom," I said, my voice as factual and surgical as a death certificate. "He told you the house was worth $187,000 to push a quick sale to his associates while I was in Bermuda. But the market appraisal I have right here is for $245,000. He pocketed the $55,000 margin for himself through an escrow account you never saw. He didn't save Jude from the collectors. He used Jude as a reason to rob you both." Jude's face, usually so full of practiced, golden boy entitlement, went slack. The $400 shirt he was wearing, the one my house was supposed to have paid for, suddenly looked like a shroud. "Wait," he stammered, his chin dropping as the reality of the math hit him. "You said the debts were cleared. You said—" "I said I'd handle it, Jude," Vance hissed, the cologne-soaked charm finally evaporating to reveal the predator underneath. I stood up, not with the heat of a victim, but with the cold, rhythmic precision of a maritime investigator who had finally brought the truth to the surface. The joint savings account I opened for you, Mom, the $18,000 safety net I built so you wouldn't have to worry in your old age, is empty. 3 withdrawals of $6,000 each while I was on the dock in Maine. The transaction trail doesn't lead to a creditor or an artist's studio. It leads to a private account in Gerald's name. The table fractured then. Uncle Roy pushed back from his chair, his voice a low, heavy rumble of conviction that cut through Beatrice's excuses. You let this man into your life, Lorraine, and he robbed your daughter. Both of them. Beatrice finally turned to Gerald, and for the first time in 37 years, I saw her look at a person without the filter of her own needs. She saw a wall that had always been a wall, and she saw the door she'd never noticed, the one Vance had used to walk away with her legacy. You're being dramatic, Lyra, Jude tried to say. The old family reflex for accountability to leave the room before it could be named. I am being accurate, I replied, staring him down until his eyes dropped to the floor, where his new shoes suddenly seemed too expensive for a man who owned nothing. The quiet title action was filed on Monday. The county recorder has already flagged the deed. The Petersons have been notified that they are living in a house with a void title. There is no more help coming, Jude. There is only math. I picked up the manila folder and my grandmother's recipe box, the one Jude had treated like a suggestion, but which I held like a compass. I didn't need to stay for the dessert that would never be served, or the apologies that would never be enough. I'm not closing the door, but I am the one who decides when it opens, I said, looking at my mother, whose face was a portrait of grief and pride, waging a war she'd already lost. And from now on, that door requires a signature that actually belongs to me. I walked out of that house, leaving the buzz of the chandelier behind me, the boring daughter finally becoming the only person in the room who knew how the story actually ended. The air in the dining room had become thin, as if the revelation of the LLC had sucked the oxygen out of the space. I reached back into my manila folder and pulled out a single high-resolution still from the security footage Captain Elias had provided. I slid it across the blue-rimmed plate of cold pot roast. It showed Vance Sterling standing in my driveway, pointing toward my front door with a proprietary air, while my mother stood beside him, clutching a set of keys she had no right to hand over. This is the exact moment the conspiracy was set in motion, I said, my voice as steady as the rhythmic beep of a ship's radar. And here is the second piece of architecture. I placed a printout of Vance's bank transaction history on the table, a digital trail of breadcrumbs that Sloane had pulled from the darkness. I watched the golden boy Jude lean forward, his eyes darting between the numbers. He was looking for a way out, a clever line, or a charming smile that would turn the tide back in his favor, but facts don't respond to charm. The $23,000 margin from the house sale and the $18,000 from the savings account were transferred into an account ending in 4,112, I noted, pointing to the highlighted rows. Does that number look familiar to you, Mom? Or did Gerald tell you he was managing it for Jude's creative future? Beatrice's mouth opened, but no sound came out. She was staring at the name on the account, Gerald Pratt. The man she had touted as the family's savior was revealed to be a scavenger feeding on the remains of her children's security. Vance Sterling tried to stand, his silver hair catching the fluorescent light. But Uncle Roy, a man who had spent 40 years building cabinets and knew a rotted joint when he saw one, put a heavy, weathered hand on Vance's shoulder. "Sit down, Jerry," Roy rumbled, his voice carrying the weight of a lifetime of quiet observation. "You've done enough talking for 1 decade. Gerald sank back into the chair, his gold pinky ring clicking against the table like a death knell. The predator was finally cornered by the very paperwork he had hoped to forge his way through. I filed the quiet title action on Monday morning, I continued, my clinical, boring tone finally acting as the hammer I'd spent years forging. The county recorder has already flagged the deed as a fraudulent transfer. My attorney, Helen Marsh, has notified the bank that issued the mortgage to the Petersons that the title is disputed. The loan is frozen, the escrow is under investigation, and the police report for forgery was filed 48 hours ago. I looked at the notary stamp number I'd circled in red. Vince Cletty will be losing his commission by the end of the week. He's already agreed to cooperate to save his own skin. Jude suddenly pushed his plate away, the sound of porcelain on wood grating like a ship hitting a reef. You're ruining everything, Lyra. I had a career. I had a plan. His voice cracked, the entitled golden child finally realizing that his mother's protection had limits when faced with the cold, hard math of a felony. He looked at Beatrice, expecting her to conjure a miracle, but she was elsewhere, lost in the realization that she had been the primary accomplice in her own daughter's erasure. I am not ruining anything, Jude, I said, meeting his gaze until he flinched and looked at his $400 shirt. I am simply concluding an audit. You and Mom built an architecture of lies for 5 years, reinforcing it with every blocked call and every returned letter. You thought my competence was your permission to neglect me, and you thought my house was your retirement fund. You chose convenience over character, and now you're left with the bill. The golden ghost of the Thorne family had finally returned to the table, but I wasn't there to eat. I was there to reclaim the deed. I watched Vance Sterling stare at his plate, the investment expert now, a small man facing 18 months of state-sanctioned silence. I watched Beatrice scroll through the text threads on Sloane's phone, the evidence that Jude had known about the LLC all along, and had helped Vance bury the paperwork. The truth has a patient way of showing up exactly when it's needed most, and tonight, it had arrived with the weight of 1,000 shipwrecks. I picked up the folder and my grandmother's recipe box. I stood up and looked at the 3 people who had spent my vacation selling my sanctuary. The house is back in my name as of 10 o'clock tomorrow morning, I said, the words falling like lead weights into the silence. And the only person who will ever have a key to it is the one who actually knows how to read the fine print. I walked out of that yellow kitchen for the last time, leaving the buzzing chandelier and the wreckage of their lies behind me. I didn't need revenge. I had the architecture of the truth, and for the first time in 32 years, I was the one navigating the ship. The legal storm settled with the same cold, rhythmic precision that I had used to dismantle it. The court order arrived on a Monday, and by Tuesday afternoon, I was standing on my own porch with a new set of keys, the 3rd set, for those who are counting. Gerald Pratt was sentenced to 18 months in state prison for felony, forgery, and fraud. The judge was not impressed by his investment expert persona. Once the audit trail showed, he'd emptied my savings and skimmed the margin on my own home. Jude filed for Chapter 7 bankruptcy on a Tuesday, moving into a cramped back bedroom at Aunt Martha's, finally learning that debt doesn't disappear, it just changes who it crushes. Beatrice was not prosecuted, but she received a formal warning from the district attorney that became a permanent part of her record, a bitter reminder that helping her golden son had cost her the only daughter who actually showed up. I am back in my kitchen now, where the afternoon light hits the oak counter at exactly 4:17, turning the grain to gold for 11 minutes before the world goes gray. My mother and I do not speak, and for the first time in 37 years, the silence between us is not a void filled with her guilt, it is honest. I stopped protecting a story that was never mine to protect, and in doing so, I found my grandmother's last recipe, tucked into the back of the box, on an old card for apple butter. She had written, "You are allowed to keep what you built, even from the people you love." I used to believe being a good daughter meant being the load-bearing wall while others set the house on fire. I was wrong. Setting a boundary is not revenge, it is architecture. I didn't lose a family. I revised it until only the truth remained. I am Lyra Thorne, and the woman with the paperwork turned out to be exactly the person they should have worried about. Thank you for sitting with me through the storm. The coffee is still warm, the mug is still chipped, and the door is finally locked from the inside.